Oh, thank you. Thank you for printing it. I was about to. Thanks a lot. All right. Okay, so our first presenter is Professor Boal from Drake University. And yeah, Professor Boal, you want to start? Feel free to share your screen.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. All right, so this is a paper on labor history a little bit, or economic history, shorter hours looking at the coal industry. Just some historical background familiar to most people here probably. Back in the 19th century up to about 1880, most US workers were working on a 10-hour day. There was a big movement at the end of the 19th century by unions, Knights of Labor, the AFL, other reformers to try to shorten the workday to 8 hours. You may remember from labor history the big strike in May of 1886, which was not really successful, but the movement continued and was gradually successful in the early 20th century. There's been a fair amount of research about why it was successful and so forth, but I'm going to have a little bit different focus. In any case, by 1920, most workers were on an 8-hour day, although still on a 6-day week until, I guess, the 1930s. All right, the research question I'm addressing is not why did industries shift 8 hours, but what was the consequence of that? And the Industrial Commission in 1901 was looking at this question and heard lots of arguments. And the fun part was that there were contradictory arguments in some cases advocating for an 8-hour day. Some thought that it would diminish the amount of work a person could do and therefore increase employment. And others would say, no, 8-hour day is just fine because it's not going to do. Now, both of these cannot be true, obviously. One way of thinking about it is the question, is the reduction and what is the elasticity of output with respect to hours? Is it 1, that is proportional reduction? Is it 0? There's no reduction. So that's the way I'm going to frame the question. By the way, there are quite a few people who, I think reformers were not really decided on which way they felt about that. They all thought that there was an improvement in health and welfare effect of it, so that would be easy to afford. Now, I want to just make sure that you know I'm not hitting a straw man here. Many well-known economists thought that there would be hardly any reduction, maybe 0 reduction in output from reducing hours of work. Again, the argument is that fatigue is so important that reduced work hours from 10 to 8, they thought would have very effect on output. They were based that on hardly any data, though. This was pretty much conjecture. All right, so I'm going to try to look at some serious data here. I'm going to look at coal mining because, first of all, unionized coal in the United States was the first to gain the 8-hour. And in the northern fields, they gained it on April 1st, 1898, and the rest of the industry gradually over the next 20 years. Coal data is plentiful, even at the mine level, so at the level of the establishment, not just aggregate. And the output, at least at any particular mine, is relatively homogeneous over time and reported in physical terms, so you can avoid confounding changes in prices with changes in quantity. So it's good for that. I have 2 data sets. The first one I'm going to look at is the state level panel data from the Mineral Resources of the United States. And they first asked about hours of work in 1903. So it's after the first wave when the northern fields went to an hour day. Unfortunately, that's not part of the data. It starts in 1903 and it goes to the present day. But here's the data I'm going to look at. Oops, let's see. Sorry. Okay, so here's what you can see was happening. As of 1903, the workers in the northern fields, about 40% of the industry were working an 8-hour day. The remainder was roughly split between 9 hours and 10 hours, about 2/3 of them on a 9-hour day and about 1/3 on a 10-hour day. And you can see that the action all happened between 1915 and 1920 when most of the industry switched to an 8-hour day. So I have state level data Here it is, and it's a panel of about 25 states, and I have data every year except for 9 when there's no data on hours for some reason. And if I try to include unionism, I have collected some data on the fraction unionized state, but that cuts down the sample a little bit. So I'm going to regress the log of output per worker per day on a bunch of things: controls, a time trend for productivity, and a dummy variable for whether they're on an 8-hour day. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so a bunch of different regressions here with different controls. I want to focus on the top variable, though. That's the fraction of workers on an 8-hour day. And you can see that in log terms, basically my results suggest that output fell per worker fell by about, well, a little bit less than 20%, I would say. If you calculate that as an elasticity, that is, you take the ratio of this change in output to the log change in hours, and here I'm going to assume that it's essentially between 9 and 10 hours is the alternative, you get elasticity pretty close to 1 down there. So the reformers were wrong. The famous economists were wrong. In fact, output fell by approximately proportional to hours of work. Okay. Now I'm going to turn to a model data set. You might not like aggregate data because mines didn't last forever. So there could have been a change in the set of mines that was happening as a result of changes in hours of work, right? So here we're going to turn to a mine level data set for Illinois. And this actually takes advantage of the fact that Illinois was in the northern field and they went to an 8-hour day on April 1st, 1898. It was probably the most thoroughly unionized state. So I think almost every mine was involved with this change. And they were working 10 hours before and then switched to 8 hours on April 1st. Okay. So I have, of course, lots of observations here. I don't have every mine in the state. I'm thinking about doing it this summer. It takes a heck of a lot of time to code all that data, but I have most of the mines in the state. And again, the dependent variable would be log output per worker per day. And then I'm going to put a dummy variable for to change the switch to an 8-hour day on April 1st, 1898. And I'll have, of course, a time trend in there too. I didn't even talk about that last time, I guess. Anyway, suppose you, instead of putting a single dummy variable for the switch to an 8-hour day, suppose you just put in year dummies. Well, you can see what's going on here. You can see at the beginning of the sample, a rise in output per worker per day, sort of stabilizing in the late 90s. And then you can see a drop with the 8-hour day. Now, 1898 was the year of transition. Okay, these are fiscal years, and 3/4 of that year was on a 10-hour day, and then the last 3 months were on an 8-hour day. So in 1898, that was a transition year, and then we moved to an 8-hour day after that. And what I see, I don't know if you see it, but I see sort of a drop there, and then gradually a recovery, which seems to be technical change, I would say. The same X's, and now instead of putting in year dummies for every year, I'm going to put a time trend in, a dummy variable for transition year, which is 1898, and then a year for 1899 and beyond when they started on the 8-hour day. And if I fit that, what do I get? Something like this. You can see where this is going. Apparently, technology was improving, and then just about the time they hit the 8-hour day, there was, of course, it was probably close to 1.2 as this would be the log output per worker per day. And you can see it dropped by about 0.2, so close to 20% there, right? So it looks like there really was, again, just as the state data said, it looks like there really was an effect of the 8-hour day, and it roughly reduced output on the order of 20%. Okay, let's look at the regression results. I have a couple different samples there, trying to make sure that I'm covering mines that actually changed and also didn't change union status at the same time, because there is a literature that says unions affect productivity, to which I have contributed, but I'm not sure it's all that great. Certainly not my papers are that great. Anyway, I'm not sure that unions do have an effect on productivity. But anyways, I have it in here, these different samples to try to control for that. Again, the top row shows the effect of the 8-hour day on productivity. It's a negative. It's statistically significant, just as in the state data. And if you calculate elasticity, it's not quite as big as what we had before, but it's definitely not zero. You can easily reject zero, and you can't reject that it's 1. So it looks like, again, the evidence says that the reformers and the famous economists were wrong. In fact, output was roughly proportional to hours of work. So state level analysis, mine level analysis gives similar results. Let me just point out the technology here too. If you look at the time trend here, you saw similar results actually in the state data, which I did not focus on, but you can see it's about 2% per year increase in output per work per day going on, regardless of hours of work, or even regardless of machine mining. I think this is what confused people who initially looked at the data 100 years ago. They could see that output seemed to be, if they took long periods of time, output seemed to be roughly constant. And that's because I think technical change overcame over time the effect of going to a shorter day. All right, so that's my presentation, and I look forward to comments. I'll stop sharing. I can figure out how.
Thank you so much, Professor Boal. You're really on time. Actually, you're 2 minutes early. Thank you so very much. All right.
Have I
Dr.
stopped sharing?
Cotterman?
Yeah, you stop sharing, Bill. I'll go ahead and share
you're
my,
fine. Yeah, Dr.
my discussion here.
Yep.
Let's see.
In the meantime, if any audience have any question, feel free to put in the chat.
Okay, great. So I read, Dr. Boal, I read your paper, and first off, at a high level, it's an extremely written, well-written piece of work. It's very, very clear. The introduction, I love how you lay out the historical framework and the groundwork. And then it's very clear in your results and analysis section how you divide each of your data sets and your analysis. All right, so at a high level, some of Dr. Boal's primary contributions from this work. He evaluates new data, recent data, in order to understand the transition in the US coal mining industry around the start of the 20th century as they transition from 10-hour to 8-hour workdays. He primarily used panel regressions while controlling for a set of variables to understand various trends. And one of his largest takeaways from this work is that the reduction in the number of workday hours may have actually reduced the output of mines, which is runs counter to a lot of public perceptions at that time. How his work fits into the broader literature. He cites a number of pieces that examine the causes and impacts of the reduction of daily hours of work. At the start of the 20th century, there were a number of industries considering as well as shifting from a number of workdays to a fewer number of workdays. He identifies a few studies, but there's not really that many studies that examine this trend specifically within the coal mining context. And I have a potential additional suggestion in terms of fitting this into the literature. You're bringing this topic forward to the present day. I know there's a lot of discussion, especially in the wake of COVID, about transitioning from 5-day to 4-day work weeks. So it would be curious to see how Dr. Boal's work fits within this present day context. And then for my last slide here, these are just a few suggestions that I had in reading the paper. Dr. Boal, you cite 2 early studies in your section 2, and then you go on and discuss new data in sections 3 and 4 that you do in your own analysis. It would be useful if you make that distinction between the 2 historical data set and a more recent data set, if you bring that to the forefront a little more, and also discuss why haven't these newer data sets been analyzed to date. You make a few references throughout your paper to the impact of technology change, and I understand that you control for technical change within your regressions. But I think this topic warrants a bit more attention in your paper because the industry was undergoing significant transformations at this point. So if you can bring in additional discussions of what kind of technology changes were going on, what kind of impacts they were having on the worker, on the plant, as well as a larger discussion of how you accounted for the changes, I think that's useful because of their impact. You talk a little bit about the level of data aggregation available in each of your data sets. Some questions that came up to me as I was reading this, do these data sets account for production specifications like downtimes that might affect output and employment? You use aggregate employment numbers, and I'm wondering whether you have more granular data that you can separate out the workers from the supervisors, and whether that might impact your final numbers. And then my last point is you have this fabulous macro level story that you're telling, and I think it would be useful as well if you have any of this data to pull in some individual worker stories and talk about how this workday actually impacted the workers. Did their quality of life and work remain the same? Were supervisors more aggressive because they had to get the same amount of work done in 8 hours? So I think this is a potential extension that you could integrate if interesting. Otherwise, really enjoyed reading it, and fabulous job.
Professor Boal, you want to respond to some of the points, if you would like to?
Thanks, that's great. That's great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Boal. So that was Professor Boal from Drake University on the presentation, Shorter Hours and Productivity. I agree with Turner, it's a really well-written paper. Thank you so very much. Okay, Dr. Cotterman, that's your turn. And Dr. Cotterman is engineering student from Carnegie Mellon.
That's right, so I'm on deck again here. Let me share the new screen. Okay, how does this look? Can you see this?
Yes, all good.
All right, great. Then good afternoon, everyone. My name's Turner Cotterman. I've just graduated with my PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. And what I've got in this presentation for you are 2 different papers that I completed during my PhD. Both of them are focused on a very similar topic. And I've got them presented in this presentation one after the other, and I've condensed the content quite a bit to try and fit within the time frame that we have here. These works at a high level are focused on understanding the transition to electrified vehicles and what that means for workers and for manufacturing. This work is motivated by the large-scale ongoing transition from the production of internal combustion engine vehicles, ICEVs, to electric vehicles, EVs. Tesla was one of the first OEMs who was mass producing electric vehicles, and they were doing this in about 2010. And then just very recently in 2021, we saw a pretty systemic change in these productions. Starting at the beginning of the year, GM, in combination with the White House, announced plans to go all electric in their vehicle fleet. And then shortly afterwards, most other OEMs fell in line. So Mercedes-Benz, for example, fell in the middle of 2021. And then by the end of the year, Toyota was kind of the last holdout, and they jumped on the bandwagon as well. So at this point, we have most OEMs who have dedicated to only producing electric vehicles in the future. And there are a number of countries around the world as well that have rules and policies in place promoting electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, the benefits are often well touted in terms of environmental considerations, such as their air quality or climate change benefits. Less well discussed and less well understood are the potential labor implications of this transition. In the case of the US, we're talking about over 1 million workers who are directly employed in the automotive manufacturing industry. These jobs tend to be very well paying. They range nowadays from $20 to $30 an hour. Although I'll note that the distribution of these wages is quite wide, and we see that the median values have been falling in recent years. And beyond the economic argument, there's also the the social argument that the quality of jobs matters for individuals' lives. So what's at stake here? We anticipate that this transition could lead to new jobs and opportunities for some, but also unemployment and loss of business for others. So it's important to anticipate these changes, and so we can get ahead and mitigate the negative changes. This work is also motivated by looking around and seeing what the what the literature says. And there's a lot of claims floating out there about the embedded labor content of producing these two different vehicle types. Most people, a lot of these are industry claims or gray literature claims. They state that internal combustion engine vehicles require more labor to build than electric vehicles. And this common argument is based on the fact that electric vehicles have a fewer number of parts than internal combustion engine vehicles. While it's true that EVs have fewer parts, we push back on the argument that fewer parts equals less labor. And that's what we want to understand in this work. Likewise, a number of studies, a fewer number, but some numbers say that EVs require more labor because, for example, they have a high level of electronics content within their systems. And then a recent analysis by the Boston Consulting Group fell in the middle, and they found that it was about equivalent to produce an ICE EV and an electric vehicle. So this is where we start our work, and we seek to understand the labor demand differences measured in units of hours, as well as the worker skill requirement differences between ICE EV, this is internal combustion engine vehicle, and battery electric vehicle, BEV manufacturing. My first paper looks at the labor demand topic, and then the second paper looks at the worker skill requirement topic. Our approach in these analyses is unique for several reasons. One, because we've gone out and collected our own industry data through partnerships, because we're applying engineering-based cost analyses, as well as statistical analyses. And throughout, we're keeping a systems level perspective of what all these changes mean for industry policies and for government strategies. So in the first piece of work, I rely on a technique called process-based cost modeling to understand the changes occurring in manufacturing settings. So process-based cost models have been around for a number of decades, and they're used to evaluate the economics of manufacturing operations, as well as the implications of alternative options through the simulation of the entire process flow. These tools are useful because they're forward-looking. They allow us to answer questions such as how will emerging technologies, their concepts, and their materials affect production costs prior to large-scale investment. I'll note too that PBCMs have been applied in the automotive application before. I've listed a few references here, but none of these works have applied these tools in the way that we're doing this work. So for our comparative analysis between ICEVs and BEVs, we start by defining our system boundaries just around the powertrain. The powertrain is a system within the vehicle that it's all those components that cause the vehicle to move forward. So within each powertrain, we pick out a set of components that we think are most impactful from a production cost and labor perspective. So on the ICEV side, we pick out these 6 different components. You probably recognize these names by talking with your mechanic. We pick out the engine block, the crankshaft, camshaft, cylinder head, transmission, and exhaust as the most important components. Whereas on the EV side, we pick out the electric motor, the inverter, which is the power electronics, and the battery pack as most consequential. So when we take all these components and we first evaluate them with our model using data from the public literature. So we build our model and we input into the model those values that we collect from the public domain in order to understand what is publicly known about the labor requirements in making these 2 different systems. So what I'm presenting here in this slide are 3 different panels. The leftmost panel it's a stack of all of those ICE components. The middle panel are those BEV components without the battery. And then the BEV battery is on its own panel on the far right side because it distorts the axes a bit. And so the initial takeaway that we get here, just by looking at public data, is that it appears that BEV labor requirements are higher than those of ICEV requirements. However, I'll note that if you look at the far right panel, this assumption really depends on which battery model we end up picking. So I'm using 3 different battery models from the literature, SOCTI, and then 2 versions of the BATPAC models that each have a very large uncertainty band. And depending on which one we think is most accurate would influence our final takeaway. So it's clear that we need a little more and improved data to reach a more robust conclusion. So then we go out and we set up a number of industry partnerships in order to collect novel shop floor level data. So I've collected data on 300 different process steps from 4 automakers, 3 automotive suppliers, 2 battery manufacturers. And a lot of this was done through personal visits to production facilities. In addition, I worked with the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, in addition to a few industry alliances in order to improve the perspectives of this piece. And the table that I'm showing here just represents the components for which I collected data and from which companies I collected that data. I'll note that I'm not saying the names of the companies, and I've listed all of them. I've anonymized all the codes here because we have confidentiality agreements in place with each of these groups. So then when we start looking at some of this industry data that I have collected, it begins to change some of the initial conclusions that we have. So on the right-hand side, what I'm showing are the same values that I showed in an earlier slide. These are the 3 different public battery models and what they suggest are the labor requirements for producing a battery. So we're ranging somewhere between, it's like 7 hours up to 20 hours. And then I compare this now to data that I collect from industry. Industry data is on the left-hand side of this plot. And so what we see fairly quickly is that the majority of those industry data points suggest higher levels of labor hours than the 2 backpack models from the literature. So it seems like industry data suggest higher levels of labor requirements than the public domain would suggest. So then I'll bring this all back together and come up for air here. What I'm showing in this plot is what I showed you in a previous slide as well. We're comparing the labor requirements for a powertrain between the ICEV and the BEV powertrain types. The literature, it appears that BEVs require more labor requirements, but the bands of uncertainty are quite wide and they overlap each other. However, when we then look on the right-hand side of this plot, where we use industry data, instead of just relying exclusively on public data, the conclusion is a lot more robust. All of a sudden, there is no overlapping between the uncertainty or the error bars. And it appears that in all scenarios, BEVs require more labor hours than ICEVs. So kind of wrapping up this piece here, why is this work important? For one, there are a number, just looking at North America, there are a number of large-scale battery gigafactories slated to open in the next 5 years. And there's a lot of discussion going on right now about developing the automotive manufacturing workforce. So if we care about these issues, then it's important to think critically about how many battery plants we open up and how we think about siting them and supporting the workforce. All right, there's a lot more I could say, but I'm gonna keep moving on here in the interest of time and speak then briefly about the second piece of work that I did within the same topic. So this additional piece is further motivated by ongoing technology changes for automotive workers. There is an enormous economic body of literature that talks about the interaction between technology changes and how they affect wages, employment, and labor outcomes. This is my one bullet summary of decades and decades of work, and I've highlighted some of the seminal pieces here. A study in the 1990s found that manufacturing workers who were displaced because of plant closures or technology change continue to experience large earning losses for many years. There's more recent work coming out that finds that technology changes affect not only the demand for workforce skill levels, but also the types of skills needed by workers. And then this is relevant and also concerning in the automotive manufacturing context because there's been a recent rise in the number of robotics and automated equipment going into these facilities. And there's questions surrounding this about what this means for those workers. So what we do in this work then is we rely on the Occupational Information Network, or ONET tool, coming from the Department of Labor, that categorizes skill levels for any occupation across an economy on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 meaning that skill is not very demanding or not very useful for their application, and 7 means it's extremely rigorous or it's very, very demanding. The ONET platform has been around for a long time, and it relies on an extensive body of literature. Our caveat, though, about this tool, though, is it doesn't include details specifically relevant to automotive manufacturing, and the descriptions of occupations are fairly aggregated. So we wouldn't be able to pick out whether a machine operator is operating in an ICEV or a BEV setting. So we decide because of this that it's important for us to go out and collect our own data. What we do is we pick out 7 different ONET skills. These are listed in the second column of this table here, which represent some physical, some cognitive, and some social skills. And we use these 7 skills to go out and interview shop floor workers in automotive facilities. So I've done 48 interviews, one-on-one interviews with shop floor workers, meaning operators, technicians, and supervisors located in the US as well as around the world. So these responses represent industry responses for those components, those key powertrain components in ICEV and BEV systems that I highlighted earlier. And then in addition to collecting these numerical values, I also collect qualitative details on worker experience, educational background, on-the-job training, job responsibilities. So this plot that I'm showing here shows the breakdown of interviews by powertrain component and by occupation. And then I'm just going to jump now into a couple of the result plots I have. What I'm showing here is a box plot comparing just the operator occupation between ICEV facilities, colored in blue, and BEV facilities, colored in green. So one of the takeaways that we see is that the interquartile range, or kind of the length or the height of each box, is more narrowly distributed from the majority of BEV skills for 5 out of 7 of the skills. And the mean values are larger for BEVs than ICEVs for 5 out of 7 of the skills, which suggests that a more homogeneous responses by BEV operators, as well as a potentially higher level of skill requirement for these operators in BEV settings. Another exercise that I did is to do a correlation matrix to understand the skill interdependencies within each occupation class. So in these 2 tables here, I'm looking at just operators, operators in BEV facilities on the uppermost table and operators in ICEV facilities on the bottommost table. And the colored cells represent correlations within each of these classes. And so what's striking in this comparison here is that we see many more skill interdependencies for the BEV versus the ICEV classes. And all of the BEV correlations are significantly positive. So this suggests that it's potentially more important as we think about preparing BEV workers for work to think about preparing for a full or a broader set of skills and how all these skills interact with each other, physical, social, and cognitive. Okay, so last slide I've got then. Takeaways from these 2 pieces of work. Firstly, in the first piece of work, we find convincing evidence that because of vehicle electrification, there may be more labor hours in powertrain manufacturing, at least in the short to medium term. So this is an optimistic takeaway for our manufacturing workforce, but it depends on the extent to which battery manufacturing will be done in this country in the future. We anticipate that there will be shifts in the location of jobs because traditional roles will be shifting from those tasks that were handled by automakers towards new third-party suppliers. So think those suppliers who are manufacturing batteries and power electronics. And we expect that the industry's transition to producing BEVs will accompany a transition of worker skills. Our results indicate that this transition may increase the demand for mid to upper level, as well as more interdependent skills within powertrain manufacturing. And I highlighted in previous slides that for BEV operators, this means probably higher and potentially more homogeneous skill levels on average. I didn't talk about this, so I'm going to skip that. And then we see more skill interdependencies for BEV operators and ICEV operators. So with that, I'll end working on sending these papers out to journals right now, and welcome any questions or comments you have at the end of the presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cotterman. And Rachel, you ready for some discussion comments?
Yeah. Great job, Turner. I don't have slides, but I'll talk a little bit about some of my takeaways from your work. So the two papers that Turner is covering look at the impacts of EVs through two different lenses, the first being the change in total labor demand, and then the second, changes in skills. So I'll touch a bit on the first piece first, the total labor demand. So it's clear that auto manufacturing is a core part of the American economy because, as Turner said, it employs a lot of people, but it also has cultural and political significance. So I think it is important to have actionable information like this about what to expect as the sector is transitioning. And when it comes to the industry claims, I agree that just assuming labor changes based on the number of parts could definitely be misleading, which does necessitate this much closer empirical study. And the key concept that's underpinning Turner's work in this first paper is process-based cost modeling, which historically manufacturers use to understand the impacts of technology choices on production inputs. And of course, in this case, the input of interest is the labor hours. And the key finding of this piece is that the EV drivetrain labor demand is not necessarily lower than the ICEV demand, and in fact, it is very likely higher. And another big takeaway for me was the fact that not only does battery labor make up the vast majority of the drivetrain manufacturing, but specifically the cell manufacturing makes up the largest portion of the battery labor. And I think that that level of granularity has implications for policy. It shows to me that just building out domestic EV manufacturing in general may not be good enough, and that the US needs to be precise about the kind of new manufacturing and onshoring we're doing, as Turner mentioned, if we really want to capture like the most critical parts of the value chain. And here it seems like the most important part is the cell manufacturing. And I think that the first paper also raises the question for me of whether we could optimize the economic benefits of other key energy transition technologies besides EVs with this kind of very granular modeling. And then the second paper touches on what I think is the logical next question: will there be changes in the worker tasks and skills? And Turner found that, like with the labor demand, the predictions for skill changes have been mixed. Different experts are emphasizing either technical and digital skills, or others emphasizing more soft skills. And if the US wants to build out a strong EV manufacturing industry and increase that domestic labor demand, we need to be able to meet that demand clearly. And skill mismatches between the different types of workers would necessitate retraining, and not being able to anticipate what those mismatches are could potentially cause bottlenecks when we're building out that workforce. So I think it's a key piece. And then the contribution of this work is the ability to draw forward-looking conclusions about the impacts as we're transitioning, which is needed for businesses and policy decisions. The primary tool used in that study was the pretty well-established O*NET skills survey. The tool can be used to measure a large set of worker skills, including everything from finger dexterity to social skills. And the authors picked a subset of relevant skills and performed 48 interviews across worker types and components. And their results suggest that BEVs may have higher skill demands in some cases, but also the key piece for me was the skill interdependencies, the fact that EV workers might need to be skilled across multiple competencies more so than traditional vehicle workers. And I think that these findings are definitely well justified in the text, but I definitely would be interested to see how they might change with larger sample sizes and potentially a larger set of skills, which are things that Turner notes as areas of further study. But I think that the process, like with the first paper, the process seems like the really key contribution. A lot like the PBCM approach, this like on the ground skill surveying provides like a next level of granularity. And I would be interested to learn about how those more detailed insights could inform developing workforce retraining programs specifically. Yeah, so overall, the two studies are demonstrations of like more rigorous approaches for reconciling all these different opinions about what the employment outcomes are gonna be. And I think that the approaches could be applied in a lot of other sectors that are relevant to the energy transition. So that's something that's really interesting to me. And I think that with more iterations on the process, they could be really useful tools for policymakers to both anticipate and figure out ways to mitigate potential burdens on workers. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reolfi. Okay.
Thank you, Rachel.
Turner, there's no time for you to respond by that, but I guess unless you have very pressing comments you want to make before Rachel.
No, just I appreciate the synopsis.
Thank you very much. Rachel, it's your turn.
Yep. Okay. Let me get my stuff up.
So Dr. Rachel Reolfi is from Carnegie Mellon, also engineering student. She is also a very good athlete, very impressive. National records.
Actually, I'm not a doctor, but I appreciate the recognition.
Yeah, about to, I was thinking that.
Okay, all right, so are you seeing my slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Reolfi. I am a former research associate at Carnegie Mellon University in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And on behalf of myself and my co-authors, I'm going to be giving a quick overview of our work on impacts of vehicle electrification on automotive service workers. So it's really perfect that I get to follow up Turner's presentation today because I think that my talk is a pretty natural complement to his. So this work started because me and my co-authors, like a lot of Americans, are interested in how the energy transition is going to affect domestic workers. And we realized that there seems to really be a gap in understanding when it comes to service workers specifically. So we know that technological shifts are going to be needed to address climate change, and then that implies workforce changes as well. And this can be a source of anxiety for a lot of people, but proactively supporting workers that could be most at risk could help improve those employment outcomes and therefore also mitigate opposition to the energy transition, which we have seen in the past. And then in general, directly impacted worker populations are a bit easier to predict because they're involved in activities that have a really clear link to greenhouse gas emissions. And some examples of those groups are like Appalachian coal workers, Gulf Coast oil drillers, and Detroit auto assemblers. But there will likely also be impacts felt up and downstream of those emitting activities, and they may be a bit harder to predict. But these indirect effects might also be larger than the direct effects. And in particular, service jobs that are linked to those energy intensive activities could be at risk. And those jobs tend to employ folks from low income and underrepresented groups, which could make them more vulnerable to transitions. So essentially, we argue that failing to address these impacts could undermine an equitable low carbon energy transition. So to dig into that concept, we used vehicle electrification as a case study. And that's because we're likely to see impacts across the entire automotive value chain. And as you learned from Turner already, there's been a lot of recent discussion on auto manufacturing workers, but I think that the auto industry is a perfect example of why we need to understand both the direct and the indirect employment groups. And that's because those groups have different workforce sizes, locations, and other characteristics, which I will be digging into more in a minute. So we thought about the automotive sector in kind of three phases. The first is auto manufacturing, then auto sales, and then auto services, which are all of the services that occur over a vehicle's lifetime. And you may or may not be surprised to know that in the US, there are more of those downstream service workers than the sales and manufacturing workers combined. And as you can see, some of the activities that occur after a vehicle's point of sale include the refueling, repair, maintenance, car washes, and part sales. So vehicle electrification perhaps is not going to inherently affect sales jobs, but for service jobs, we expect that there could be changes in the day-to-day tasks and potentially overall labor requirements in some or all of these service categories specifically, due to things like changes in the refueling practices, maintenance schedules, and repair needs that we're starting to see with EVs. So, like I said before, the direct and indirect auto workforces are not just different because of size, like we just saw, but they also have different characteristics. So, for example, unsurprisingly, on the right, you can see that labor data from the current population surveys show that auto manufacturing workers are heavily concentrated in the Midwest and the South. But if you look at the map on the left, the auto service workers are a pretty different story. They're actually pretty widely distributed throughout the country, which makes sense because every part of the country is going to need some basic vehicle services like gas stations and mechanics. But it's also worth noting that the distribution is not perfectly uniform. Generally, we're seeing that the concentration seems to be highest in some sparsely populated states. And that's an area for further study, but this could be due to things like differences in vehicle ownership and driving patterns. So auto service workers also have a number of characteristics that could make them vulnerable to transitions. So for example, about 60% of vehicle service workers have just a high school diploma or less, compared to 40% of the US workforce at large. And considering that most US jobs require post-secondary education, that could leave a relatively smaller pool of jobs for those displaced workers. And then additionally, the average income for a vehicle service worker is about 40% lower than the average US worker, which could leave them with fewer resources during periods of unemployment. And then finally, union membership could help protect wages and benefits during transitions, but it's relatively low among vehicle service workers. Compared to about 12% of the US workforce, less than 1% of vehicle service workers are unionized. So now we've established that the workforce is large and that it could be vulnerable to disruption. And next we wanted to understand how vehicle electrification specifically might affect them. So, and there is reason to believe that there could be some impacts. For example, switching from an ICEV to an EV could reduce or eliminate a lot of traditional maintenance activities, such as oil changes and brake replacements. And clearly gas stations are going to need to pivot their operations in a world without gas-powered cars. So our hope was to find existing studies that have started to estimate those changes across the different vehicle service categories. But we found that the literature was pretty lacking. There were a handful of studies that explicitly looked at changes in repair labor, but that information is pretty limited for our purposes because repair work is just one of multiple service activities that could be affected. And in fact, the same worker who's doing repair activities could also be performing routine maintenance. So to fill in the gaps, we ended up incorporating studies that estimated changes in service revenue or equivalently cost due to electrification. And acknowledging that changes in revenue are not necessarily a perfect indicator for changes in labor, but we think that it can be a starting point for exploring the issue. And then so throughout the rest of my talk, I'll be focusing mostly on just repair and maintenance workers, because that is the one area where we believe that revenue and labor could be a little bit more closely comparable than gas station workers, for example. Okay. So we ended up looking at a total of 25 studies, which are referenced at the end of the deck for those that are interested. But the authors presented their results in a lot of different ways, like labor per repair, annual revenue, or even like cost per mile. But wherever possible, we tried to normalize the results in terms of the expected change per EV, because that's what we were really interested in, that like fundamental change for each vehicle. And So the figure here represents the 20 studies that were related to vehicle maintenance and repair. And as I said, a few at the top looked at labor demand per repair. A few more looked at repair revenue in the middle. And then on the bottom, many more looked at maintenance and repair revenue combined. And as you can see, the estimates vary really widely. In some cases, the authors differ not only on the magnitude, but on the direction of the change. So acknowledging that high uncertainty in those existing studies, we still wanted to try to create a framework for how we could estimate changes, how we could estimate impacts on US workers based on those changes per EV. So to start building that model, we needed the number of conventional vehicles and EVs, and we get that by combining the total number of vehicles and the EV adoption rate. And I'll note that for now, I'm not talking about any particular point in time or even any location. Those could be real numbers from today's fleet or a hypothetical future fleet, and they could be at the national level or the state level. So then to turn that number of vehicles into labor demand, we need the labor demand per vehicle, which is exactly what I described that we were trying to pull from literature on the previous slide. So then if we have those three inputs, we can combine them to find the total labor demand. So as I said, that framework can be used for any location or any time. And then for illustrative purposes, we decided to create a set of specific scenarios. So to capture uncertainty in the number of EVs adopted, we created 2 adoption scenarios. And they're based on the 2 scenarios in the IEA 2021 Global EV Outlook. Our low adoption scenario is based on the stated policy scenario, and it implies a uniform 7-time increase in EVs in each state by 2030. And then the high adoption scenario is based on their sustainable development scenario, which implies a 16% increase. And then to capture uncertainty in the second piece, which is the change in labor per EV, we ran the model using the lowest and highest labor change estimates across the literature. And we labeled those in terms of whether they're most or least harmful to workers, which we're calling worst case and best case, respectively. And then to demonstrate this, we are just using the values from one subsector, the vehicle maintenance and repair, like I said, because we needed to make that assumption that the changes in revenue are a pretty close proxy for changes in labor demand. And then last note is that we're using 2019 as a base year, and we have a few data sources to fill in the known values. We have the total number of vehicles in every state based on the Federal Highway Administration, and the number of EVs is from the Alternative Fuels Data Center. So this visual shows the range of outcomes that we get from those scenarios that I just described. So naturally, we're seeing the most benefits for workers from the best case high adoption scenario, and then the most negative impacts from the worst case high adoption scenario. So clearly, the outcome varies significantly based on that change in labor per EV. And that highlights the fact that we need more data and analysis than just the simple revenue estimates that we were using to really understand the impacts. But regardless of that value, it is interesting that there's some variation between states. We're seeing the biggest impacts occurring where service workers were already a large portion of the total employment in the state. And those changes are subtle in the low adoption, but then of course, higher adoption is amplifying the effect. And then another interesting area for future study would be about how this would look if we didn't use just a constant adoption multiplier. For example, we could assume that states with the most EVs today continue to be growing the fastest. And so then the service workers in those states would be affected disproportionately, probably. And yeah, so I wanted to, okay. I wanted to reiterate that these projections are not fully reflecting the challenges that could be ahead. There's likely going to be additional changes in other subsectors that have not yet been quantified. For example, the spare part and accessory sales and refueling. All right, and this is my last slide, thankfully. So in summary, we consider this study to be just a first step towards understanding the importance of service workers in the energy transition. And while none of this is guaranteed, there is at least significant potential for the impacts on these auto service workers to be large and disproportionately falling on vulnerable groups. But deliberate policy that anticipates those challenges can help to support at-risk workers. And this is essential both to enhance equity and also to keep us accelerating towards our climate goals without major opposition. And then this is particularly true for governments and states that are going to face the most acute effects. They could explicitly include these vehicle service workers in their transition planning. And here are some examples of how they could do that through supporting career counseling and training for adjacent opportunities and leveraging public sources of support for early retirement, given that small businesses might have limited resources to do that themselves. And so overall, we need to create space for American workers to thrive in the emerging net zero economy. And as this shows, that includes making sure that the auto workforce can outlast the internal combustion engine.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And Professor Boal, you have some comments for Rachel? Okay, we have some chats in the meantime. Professor Boal, if you have your slides, you're ready to load. In the meantime, let's Douglas.
Hi. I'm here. I'm ready to go.
Okay, great.
And let me share my screen here. I'll skip some of my comments here in the time. I just want to point out to the audience that they're trying to forecast the employment losses due to switch to electric vehicles. I think the most difficult thing they face is that the reduction, they're using cost, they're assuming that labor hours are proportional to maintenance cost, and the estimates of cost savings in going to electric vehicles vary hugely. So that's one thing that vexes the effort. And of course, they're not sure exactly how fast these vehicles will be adopted. So that's the other big issue that creates a large variance in their forecasts. I'm going to suggest maybe not use the extreme values, maybe emphasize the 10th percentile, 90th, or first or third quartiles for the reduction in cost, because that seems to be all over the map. It might be useful. They also assumed a fixed total number of vehicles. And I thought maybe this could be relaxed. You know, I mean, we have a growing population. I assumed the number of vehicles were increasing with population. I'm not up on this data, but when I looked up total automobile registrations, it actually fallen in recent years. I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, if you could get a reasonable forecast as to what the total number of vehicles would be, this might make you, assuming that vehicles are rising, this might make things look a little bit better in terms of employment losses, right? There'll be more electric vehicles, but more total vehicles. So the last paragraph was really interesting, and the author talked a little bit about this. This is what in Principles of Macroeconomics, which I teach, we call structural unemployment, right? A mismatch of skills. Although structural unemployment also can mean a mismatch of location. I think I'm optimistic on both points because, as a presenter pointed out, maintenance workers are diffused across the country. They're not concentrated in a few cities and so forth. So the chances of being able to find another job without moving are much better. The other issue, though, is whether the existing workers on internal combustion engines can switch to electric vehicles. That's the big issue. And if they cannot, then the displacement is much larger than what they're presenting. I think on this point, we can be optimistic too. There's some evidence that people are already switching. And of course, when they moved to hybrid cars, they had to learn some of the basic things about, you know, high voltage batteries and so forth that they'll need for electric vehicles too. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Boal. And Rachel, you want to quickly address that? We actually ran out of time, but good thing this is the last session. So
Yeah,
if you want to
yes.
stay, feel free to.
Sorry you didn't have more time to talk, Bill, but yeah, I appreciate that commentary.
Okay. Thank you very
I
much.
posted my my comments on the box. You
I
can
saw that.
access
Thank
them
you.
there.
Thank you, Professor Boal. Okay, I also appreciate everybody so cooperative, you know, post your slides and paper and the comments as well. Thank you so much. And yeah, Turner even put his bio there as well. Thank you so much. That's
Ting, I see a comment here. Can I respond quickly to the
please.
chat comment?
I was just about to say that. Yep.
Yeah, great. Douglas, I see the comment that you've left. That's fabulous. I don't want to speak for, hi Douglas. I don't want to speak for Rachel, but I know that she and I both focus on the passenger vehicle side, but I think that a lot of our insights can be extended to commercials. From my perspective or my background, you know, as we think about commercial or transit buses, you know, they can Proterra, they're quite small right now, but I would imagine that there'll be more of those in the future, and they absolutely require, well, they rely on batteries, of course, more batteries than you find in a passenger vehicle. So my findings are optimistic in that this potentially would generate additional workforce opportunities for workers in the manufacturing space related to the construction of these vehicles. But maybe I'll let Rachel speak to anything on the service side of these vehicles.
Yeah, the only thought that comes to mind is that the interesting thing about the more heavy duty vehicles space is that electrification is not the only potential solution, and a lot of people are looking at things like hydrogen and electric fuels that could be introducing a whole new set of complexities for labor. So I think it's a really interesting space for future work.
Thank you. Yeah.
And as Rachel's paper also mentioned, that even if there's some skill transition to some extent, but big majority of the vehicle related workforce actually is in service, which is transitional easily, relatively speaking, from previous skill sets. So that's a good part of it. And in addition to the two electrified vehicle paper, Professor Boal's paper is also very interesting on mining industry. Even if the mining industry is relatively small, in a sense declining, but the working hour findings is very interesting. Is hours reduction, particularly the time trends as well. So yeah, I think that's very nice. We have those paper together with different industry and different trends. And so any other questions from the audience or comments? Okay, if not, I have very quick, some quick notes on from Professor Boal's paper. I'm kind of wondering whether there's a, the hours reduced historically to the 8 hours, with how much is because of the demand of mining work jobs is declining, and how much you think is also because of the advancement of working conditions. That's kind of, I'm curious about that. And for Turner's paper, I have one question. And you mentioned about the industry data versus the public data is quite different, and kind of wondering what are the main, why they are so different.
Yeah, we started this work by modeling just the public data, and then when we saw that wasn't enough, we modeled the industry data to get more robust answers. The differences between the data sets. Well, number one, that the industry data is hardly ever publicly accessible. I've seen a couple comments spread out in government reports and various consulting reports that I grabbed and used, but most of the time this industry data is kept very close to the heart by these companies because it's such a competitive space right now. So that just isn't accessible. So then the public literature is where is accessible to everybody, but it's there's a lot of uncertainty in the values that are reported, uncertainty between papers, between sources. I think I'm using references from the public domain that some of them are 40 years old, some of them are 2 years old, so they span a really wide range, which may not be reflective of the current state of manufacturing. And authors tend to disagree with each other in terms of assumptions and results. So I'd say use a lot of grains of salt if you're relying exclusively on the public data, which is why we suggest in this paper to lean more into the industry data.
Thanks so much, Turner. Professor Boal.
Yes, you were wondering whether it was a declining industry. Actually, in the period I'm studying, coal was expanding rapidly. In fact, it expanded especially rapidly from 1915 to 1920. Europe was at war, demand for coal was very high, coal prices were high, and coal mining was expanding rapidly in the United States. That's the same period in which hours are shrinking. Employment is rising fast, but hours are actually shrinking, and the union was becoming much, much stronger. By about 1920, it was the largest union in the United States, United Mine Workers. So very different from today in coal mining.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot from everyone's presentation as well. If no one else has questions, then we will conclude this session. We are 7 minutes beyond the end time anyhow. Thank you so much for everyone's patience. Excellent papers. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Ting, thank you for organizing. Thank you for chairing.
Thank you. All right. Everybody have a great Sunday afternoon. And this is the end of the LERA session. Yay. Bye.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Bye.